Good morning. I'm Joshua Johnson from KQED News. Good to see you all this morning. Yeah, I know. Pastor, this happens everywhere I go. Every time I talk to people, they're always like, "Oh, you're Joshua Johnson. I never would have guessed you were black." We're just going to ignore that side of the theater. I'm just going to talk to you.
I'll follow your lead.
Yeah, we'll make it work. We'll make it work. But I really am Joshua Johnson from KQED News. Glad to have you all here this morning to talk about a very valuable subject. I'm also, per KQED's media sponsorship, we're very glad to be part of Uncharted. We're also very proud to be doing a special series on race this month called So Well Spoken, airing Mondays after Forum on KQED Public Radio. And in the spirit of that, Pastor McBride, we're glad to be able to speak to you about one of the topics that kind of pushed us to do So Well Spoken, was this movement that emerged after the shooting death of Michael Brown. And once Black Lives Matter emerged, not just as a hashtag, but as a living thing in the streets, it kind of pushed us to do what we're now doing. So welcome, glad to have you here.
So glad to be here, and thank you to Lance of Berkeley side and Uncharted, everybody that gave a brother a chance to sit on the stage.
I know, two brothers.
Two brothers.
This may be a record.
Yes, but I think I'm the one that says controversial things, I think.
Well, yes, and I'm paid to be warm and hostile.
All right. So you'll smooth out all the controversial stuff I'll say.
I didn't say that.
Oh, okay.
I might just let it sit and be what it is.
All right.
Which, to the point, I'm glad you brought that up, because if you do have questions or comments or thoughts, please feel free to write them down on the comment cards. We'll get in as many as we can before our 23 minutes and 11 seconds are up. But I work in radio, I can do a lot with 23 minutes. Black Lives Matter, what does that mean? Give it to us in our most basic form.
Well, Black Lives Matter certainly seems to be the expression of the most marginalized young people in particular who decided the night that Michael Brown, or the day that Michael Brown was killed, they said they weren't going to take it anymore. And Black Lives Matter did not emerge immediately as a kind of umbrella nomenclature for this movement of black liberation in this era, but it certainly fits within a continuum of black liberation struggle that has been happening since the days descendants of Africans came to this continent in chains.
Black liberation is also a term that ties to black theology, to the emergence of the black church.
Yes, absolutely. So, there's always been a resistance to the forces of white supremacy, white domination, capitalism, etc. in this country, expressed by the very lived realities of black people in particular. And every liberation struggle has drunk from the wells of black liberation, and Black Lives Matter then represents what this generation has been able to do, reappropriate and contextualize for our particular moment the worst kind of oppression and violence that is being perpetrated across this country in every city, every neighborhood where large numbers or even small numbers of black folk live. So Black Lives Matter has become an important way to really sum up what we think is reality.
You gave an interview to Berkeley side last year in which you said that the shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri was basically the last straw. Yes. That it was the spark that lit the fire nationwide and touched off what we now call Black Lives Matter. But as I think about it, it wasn't an inconceivable situation. These kinds of shootings happen all the time. Michael Brown wasn't anybody rich, famous, or powerful. Ferguson, Missouri is a city that probably none of us had heard of until this happened. What do you think it was about this incident, in this instance, that touched everything off?
It was the young people. So I showed up in Ferguson less than, my team showed up in Ferguson less than several days after the killing of Michael Brown. And it was very clear to us that it was not just the shooting death of Michael Brown, but leaving him in the street for 4.5 hours triggered an anger that the young people and families would not let go. Really what exacerbated the tensions that were on the ground was the response of the municipality, the law enforcement, and subsequently the military complex that rolled into an American city in full force against unarmed young black people. And that in and of itself I believe, distinguished the killing of Michael Brown from the killing of many other young people that happened all across this country. It was the response of this government to a grieving, traumatized community. It was a further dehumanization of a community, and it was the courage of the young people that said, we will not take it anymore, and they used the only weapon that they had, their body and their voices, and that triggered the largest military apparatus response that our generation has seen into the streets of Ferguson, and I think that galvanized people all across, not just the country, but the world.
It also occurs to me that this idea of using bodies and voices to send this message has been a constant of the civil rights movement. I mean, whether it was people getting sprayed with fire hoses or sick with dogs, or the walk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge that made the evening news, there's something about the nation having to watch this, because it was wall to wall on every cable news channel with people protesting and tear gas canisters and fires in the street. Just the optics of it made it impossible for anyone to say, okay, we don't need to worry about this. Everyone had to talk about it.
Well, it's really interesting, right? Because I think I want to try to nuance this a little bit. It wasn't just the presence of black bodies. It was the kind of black bodies. So let's be clear, when we think of the civil rights movement, the way it was packaged and the way that strategically it was presented to the world was very respectable, middle class, educated black folk that could ease the tensions and fears and anxieties of mainstream white culture. Ferguson was the total opposite of that. Some of the young people were out there, they had tattoos on their face, they had tattoos on their tongues, they had, bandanas on, they had their face. It looked like the latest hip-hop video, which is, in many regards, the worst thing that this culture in our large society wants to associate or at least embrace about black culture. So part of what, again, this movement has really lifted up is that all lives of black folk in this country have to matter, not just the respectable ones, not just the ones that make white folk feel comfortable. And this, I think, is the greatest contribution of this movement. And it is a great challenge for, I think, particularly progressive culture, progressive politics, progressive sensibilities, because as I'm famous for saying here in the city of Berkeley, being progressive may not be good for black folk. Because you can be progressive about everything except for being black and poor. And part of what this movement, I think, has really unlocked, even among progressives of all stripes, is that it is the poorest of the poor that have to continue to find themselves at the center of any meaningful conversation about the value and dignity of lives, not only in this country, but particularly across the world.
Let me play off that for a second. In the Bay Area in California, I wonder if we actually do believe, kind of to the point you were making, that black lives do matter.
No.
I mean, African Americans.
No, we don't.
No.
No, we don't.
Well, I think of it in terms of, well, I mean, that's the short answer.
Short answer. But we can
talk about the long answer.
Let's read on.
We got the short answer. You see how this is going to go for the next 18 minutes. The Census Bureau projects that California's black population is going to drop from 4% of the state now to 2% of the state by the year 2040. The Pew Research Center has forecast that the black population in the nation over the next 50 years will remain almost perfectly flat, while many other demographics of color will increase. And it occurs to me, if you hear the presidential debate, Bernie Sanders mentioned the unemployment rate among black and Hispanic children. He got the number a little bit high, but not that far over. That all of the metrics look bad for people who look like you and me. Mm-hmm. And living in the Bay Area, it makes me feel, me personally, doing a very white-collar job in a very mainstream media outlet, like a bit of a unicorn, because there's nothing about me that mirrors the experience, the daily lived experience of black people here. If black lives matter, if black lives do not matter in the Bay Area, in California, what does that mean for our future?
Well, I have a great amount of despair some days when I think of the future for black families, my black daughters, and our ability to feel at home in a country that has never demonstrated love for us. we must acknowledge that there has not been one day in the history of the United States where black bodies, black people have not been vulnerable to arbitrary violence and oppression that is strategic, systemic, and organized. So to the extent that this reality is a reality that black folk did not create, I continue to believe, particularly as a faith leader, I continue to tell many of the folks in my wheelhouse that the role of people of faith, the role of our white brothers and sisters, those who have privilege, those who have access and means, those who are attempting to get as far up the ladder as we can, our role is to deconstruct these systems and forces of oppression, that it is not the responsibility solely of the oppressed to destroy systems of oppression. It must be the work of every single human being who realizes that we are all created, as I would say, in the image of God. We have a shared dignity and humanity that goes deeper than the phenotype or the color of our skin. So the future, I believe, is really a future that we all must live in together. The challenge is that until we really believe that the contributions of black folk, brown folk, poor folk, all folk is what actually makes our world the best possible world it can be, until we really believe that, then we will continue to see the lives and bodies of black folk expendable.
Let's play on that for a second, because I've had this conversation with other people as well. W. Kamau Bell and I had this conversation on stage a while ago, in which I asked this question, and I wonder how you would answer it. And by the way, speaking of questions, feel free to send yours in. I'll start jumping to your questions in just a moment. If we do not pay attention to the needs of black and brown people in the Bay Area, let's say specifically black people in the Bay Area, in San Francisco and Berkeley and elsewhere, what's the worst that can happen? What are we really missing? What are we really losing? What are we really at risk of if people who look like you and I don't make it through the next few decades? What do we really miss?
Well,
what's at stake?
What's at stake is we miss the inherent brilliance to be able to see the full expression of humanity. We retreat back into homogenous expressions of life that I think are never fully able to give an account of the kind of diversity and giftedness of the other, of particularity. And certainly, if we just take a look at the concrete contributions of black folk in this country, the inventions that have come from the minds and the hands and the hearts of black folk, we don't even know what the next 100 years of inventions and contributions are being stunted because black bodies are being pushed out of schools and into prisons. Gentrification is overtaking our communities that have been historically filled with rich culture of black folk. We don't know the kind of things that we are missing in the future, but we do know that if history tells the story, inventions, cultural products, music, leadership, moral authority, imagination, all of these things are just as much a part of the lives of black folk as any other folk. And we should want to keep that very much in the city of Berkeley, in the city of Oakland, in the city of San Francisco. And that is what's very much at risk.
I want to get to one of the audience questions, because one of the people in the audience asked something that I was going to ask about as well. And because we're thinking of the same thing, you get to go first. The Democratic presidential debate. Sterling Arthur Wilkins, who is a 23-year-old law student from Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa, asked the question, do black lives matter or do all lives matter? Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, and Martin O'Malley said, yes, black lives matter. Jim Webb said something else.
Right.
He talked about his record with African Americans.
And his black friend.
And his black friend. That guy, that one guy. But he didn't really answer the question directly. What do you make of how Black Lives Matter is affecting our politics?
So, if there was one winner of that evening, it has been all of the young people and activists that have been in the streets for the last year. I don't care about which one of the candidates won. I think victory has been for us in our movement. I have been involved in national political conversations with Democrats, progressives, conservatives, Republicans, for at least 5 or 6 years, trying to get folks to actually talk explicitly about race, about the prison industrial complex, about urban gun violence, about mass incarceration. And I've been laughed out of rooms from the White House all the way down to the mayor's office here in the city of Berkeley. So, to have the presidential candidates have to spend an extended amount of time trying to articulate, form their lips to say, Black Lives Matter is an extreme victory, and I pray and hope that many of us involved in the movement, even though many of them did not say what we would want them to say, per se, just them saying it is important. And we must not miss out as well on this fact that for all of us who, how many of y'all were inconvenienced by any of the Black Lives Matter protests in the last year? Anyone? And how many of y'all, keep it real, man, you ain't got to be in church to, tell the truth or wherever. But how many of us, kicked our car and cussed and, you protesters, get out of the street, why are you? Any of y'all? No? A few? Right?
I'm willing to admit it.
The reality is this, that kind of inconvenience, that social disruption was required just to get Bernie Sanders to say Black Lives Matter. For him to say Sandra Bland, remember, say her name was the Netroots interruption led by these wonderful black sisters who were just asking him to say her name. He said her name during the presidential debate. Hillary Clinton was in Ferguson. She, when first asked the question, said all lives matter. So somebody had to give her a nice education. Governor O'Malley, we saw the way he flubbed it. He had to meet with some folk to get a nice education. Folks don't take Jim Webb, obviously, that seriously because nobody felt like they had to, turn up on him.
Clearly.
So he kept going with his old tired tropes of I got a black friend and look at my record and all this other kind of stuff. So I guess all I will say to us is liberation and freedom do not come cheap. And many of us who are in the streets attempting to try and reset the worst conditions that we're experiencing in this country, you have to excuse the inconvenience and realize that for us, our lives are literally at stake, and we're going to keep turning up. We're going to keep having social disruption. We just invite all of y'all to come join us.
Let me get to a few more of the audience comments. This feels like forum. I am inundated right now. One person in the audience wrote, and I beg your pardon if I butcher your handwriting. I'm sorry in advance. I'm going to do the best that I can. It gives the long-needed, long-awaited, long-missing black voices we are just now finally beginning to hear. Sing it out, brothers. Another person in the audience said, as a bit of a counterpoint, it's so shameful that we are even having this conversation. All lives matter. Shame on all of us. What specifically can the U.S. government do for black lives?
Reparations.
The R word.
Reparations. See,
no, wait, before you go there. I'm not going to define what you mean by reparations.
Well, when there is harm, you have to repair the harm. That's all I mean. And it seems to be only black folk that are being asked to just get over it. Not as if it was 400 years ago. The city of Oakland just filed a lawsuit against Wells Fargo because in 1999, 98, 99, 2000, or maybe it was more recent, 2009, they have been found that they're continuing to redline African American customers who are attempting to get capital to build wealth and businesses and homes in the city of Oakland.
And by redlining, you mean locking people of color out of getting loans?
Absolutely. Banks have been fined hundreds of millions, some as much as billions of dollars just in the last several years because they've been proven to have stolen the wealth. The largest transfer of wealth from the black community has happened in the last 10 years. We're talking about just what's happened hundreds of years ago. We're talking about the systemic and structural nature of looting that is happening in the black community. So when I talk about reparations, I talk about how do we restore and repair. Restore what's been lost and repair the system so they do not do the damage again. And I believe housing subsidies, accounts for education, forgiveness of debt, making sure that us in the Bay Area and many other neighborhoods and cities across the country where gentrification is taking place, that that folks are able to build wealth and buy homes at the rates where they were locked out of in the 1960s. There's a great brother up at UC Berkeley that talks a lot about the way housing has been the single biggest economic engine and disparity driver for wealth building, particularly in communities of color. Reparations to me, as radical as it sounds, and I just kind of got radicalized. That's what happens when you get tear gassed and shot with rubber bullets. You lose all your respectability. You start to realize that we have to figure out a way to accelerate liberation for our generations.
I want to get to a few more questions. There are a few questions I'm going to try to amalgamate. By the way, I hope that we can continue this conversation on Monday, if you feel like tuning into So Well Spoken. One of the questions actually speaks to exactly what Monday's show is about. One person asked, will technology aid the improvement of overcoming oppression? Or will technological advances cause a larger separation of poor communities and those that implement technology?
Yeah, so what we saw in Ferguson, which in many respects helped launch the movement as an international movement, when we were in Ferguson being tear gassed, we were being tweeted live by Palestinian youth who were telling us how to survive the tear gassing. They told us to get maylocks. They told us to wet our shirts and put it over our faces so we could continue to protest while we were being tear gassed. Now, the most disturbing part of this is we picked up a tear gas canister, and we had a young person from Palestine tweet us, and it was the exact same tear gas canister that was on the streets of Ferguson, was also in the neighborhoods of some of our Palestinian young folk. Technology, Twitter, and social media has been the single biggest engine. The ability for young folk to access technology has been the single biggest engine to drive this movement in this moment. But it can also be one of the single biggest weapons. The history of COINTELPRO and the destabilizing of movements is very well documented, and it is very clear that surveillance, subversive tactics are being employed. I am being surveilled, I have no doubt about that. Many of my comrades across the country are being surveilled. Our Twitter feeds, our Facebook pages, our Instagram accounts are all being surveilled and all kinds of things. So it is a gift, but it is also possibly a curse. I believe we have to, continue to use the tools and apparatus for their best possible purposes. I don't find technology to be a neutral thing. I think it's a tool, and hopefully it will be used for a tool of liberation and not oppression.
I want to keep talking about what people can do, but first I wanted to make sure you had a chance to talk about a film screening that's taking place at your church of a movie called 3.5 Minutes. Very briefly, tell us what that is and when it is.
3.5 Minutes is a movie chronicling the story of Jordan Davis. He was a young man in Jacksonville, Florida, who was killed by a white man who felt like he was playing his music too loud. And he shot through the car in a gas station, killed this young man, made up a big, elaborate story. And the film captures the power of bias, of prejudice, and the ways in which the criminal justice system is not always structured and able to deliver justice for families of those who are directly impacted. We are showing the film with Google and a few other partners. The family of Jordan Davis, the parents who helped executive produce the film, are coming in town November 3rd at the Castro Theater. You can go to our website, livefreeusa.org. Myself, the parents, Patrice Kohlers from Black Lives Matter, the co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Uncle Bobby from the Oscar Grant, Jennifer Eberhardt, who is a MacArthur Genius Award winner, who lifts up all this wonderful information about implicit bias. We'll have a wonderful conversation. It's not at my church. It's at the Castro Theater in San Francisco, November 3rd at 6:30.
Briefly, before we run out of time, there are a number of people asking what should average white people do that would help the most. One person asked about using white privilege. There are policy changes the Black Lives Matter campaign is proposing, specific things that you would like people to do tomorrow, this week, this month, to be a part of the movement, presumably if you are not black, if you're white and sympathetic? What can you do?
So one of the great things that we've been saying is Black Lives Matter is not a movement only for black people. We do believe that racial justice fights should be led by those directly impacted. So one of the best things that white folk can do is follow black leadership. What my good brother said, it's not a question if black lives matter, the question is, does black power matter?